Originally published by Afterhours Archive 613. This audio edition is adapted from the original written article. Afterhours Archive 613 Hip-Hop as Culture. When hip-hop went to the United Nations, the story of the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace. Editorial note. Hip-hop has become one of the world's most influential cultural movements, yet many of the documents, institutions, and philosophies that helped shape it remain largely unknown outside dedicated historical circles. This feature examines one of those overlooked moments, the presentation of the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace at United Nations headquarters in New York on May 16, 2001. Drawing on primary documents and historical sources, this article explores the circumstances that led to its creation, the vision it presented, and why this chapter of hip-hop history deserves to be remembered. The story few people tell. On May 16, 2001, something happened at United Nations headquarters in New York that many hip-hop fans have never heard about. There were no platinum records being presented, no album release, sold-out concert, or award ceremony. Instead, approximately 300 pioneers, artists, educators, activists, government officials, and cultural contributors gathered for a different reason. They came together to present a document they believed could help preserve the future of hip-hop itself. They called it the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace. For a culture that has produced countless documentaries, biographies, museum exhibitions, and university courses, it is remarkable how rarely this moment is discussed. Ask someone about hip-hop history and they might tell you about DJ Kool Herc's parties in the Bronx. They might mention Run DMC, Public Enemy, Tupac Shakur, the Notorious B.I.G., Lauryn Hill, or Kendrick Lamar. Others might point to graffiti, breakdancing, sneaker culture, or the rise of streaming. All of those stories deserve to be told, yet they leave behind a different question. How did a culture born in neighborhood parks and community gatherings eventually find itself inside one of the world's most recognizable diplomatic institutions? The answer begins long before anyone enters the United Nations. It began with a misunderstanding that has followed hip-hop for decades. To many people, hip-hop is music. To many of its pioneers, music was only one facet of the story. More than a soundtrack. The words hip-hop and rap are often used interchangeably. In everyday conversation, that shorthand is understandable. Rap became the most visible expression of the culture, dominating radio stations, television, streaming platforms, festival stages, and eventually global popular music. For millions of listeners, rap became hip-hop. Many of the culture's pioneers, however, have long made a different distinction. Rap is an art form. Hip-hop is the culture from which it emerged. That difference sits at the heart of the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace. Rather than defining hip-hop through record sales or chart positions, the Declaration describes it as an independent collective consciousness, expressed through breaking, MCing, graffiti art, DJing, beatboxing, street fashion, street language, street knowledge, and street entrepreneurialism. It also recognizes that future generations may add new expressions as the culture continues to evolve. That definition immediately changes the conversation. If hip-hop is only music, then its history can be measured through albums, artists, and commercial success. If hip-hop is a culture, then its history becomes much larger. It includes the DJs who transformed turntables into instruments, the writers who turned subway cars and brick walls into galleries, the dancers who developed entirely new forms of movement, the MCs who carried neighborhood stories from block parties to international stages. It includes the language people created, the businesses they built, the communities they organized, and the knowledge they passed from one generation to the next. The Declaration reflects that broader understanding. It asks readers to see hip-hop not as a product sitting on a store shelf, but as something living. That idea did not emerge in 2001, it had been developing for decades. Before hip-hop became an industry. To understand why a declaration was necessary, it helps to remember what hip-hop looked like before it became a billion-dollar business. The culture did not begin inside corporate boardrooms or recording studios. It began in neighborhoods, parks where extension cords stretched from apartment windows to power speakers. In recreation centers where DJs experimented with breakbeats while dancers filled whatever floor they could find. On basketball courts, sidewalks, and street corners where young people built something for themselves because very little had been built for them. There was no blueprint. No major label waiting to sign the first MC, no streaming platform measuring monthly listeners, and no expectation that this new form of expression would one day influence nearly every corner of popular culture. The people creating it were not trying to launch an industry. It was the creation and preservation of a community. Communities and industries preserve different things. Industries preserve revenue, while communities preserve identity. An industry asks what will sell, and a culture asks what should survive. As hip-hop grew throughout the 1980s and 1990s, those two priorities increasingly occupied the same space. Commercial success brought opportunities that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Artists reached audiences across continents. Independent voices entered mainstream conversations. Fashion, language, and music once dismissed as local expressions became global influences. Growth also created tension. Who now represents hip-hop? The pioneers who had built it. The artists selling millions of records. Record executives. Television networks. Magazine covers. Or the communities where the culture had first taken shape. These were not abstract debates taking place inside universities. They were valid questions emerging from within hip-hop itself. As the culture expanded, many feared that commercial visibility might eventually overshadow cultural memory. If future generations only encountered hip-hop through record sales and celebrity, what parts of its history would disappear? That concern became one of the driving forces behind an extraordinary gathering in New York during the spring of 2001. May 16, 2001. By the spring of 2001, hip-hop was no longer asking whether it had changed the world. It already had. Its music filled arenas, while its artists topped international charts. Its influence stretched beyond speakers into fashion, advertising, film, television, politics, language, and education. What had begun as a local cultural movement had become a global one. Success, however, brought an unexpected challenge. The larger hip-hop became, the harder it became to define. For some, it had become a business, while for others, it remained a culture. Those two ideas are not necessarily incompatible, but they are not identical either. A business can measure profits. A culture measures something far more difficult to quantify: memory, identity, purpose, and legacy. Against that backdrop, representatives from across the hip-hop community gathered at United Nations headquarters in New York on May 16, 2001. According to the Declaration and later historical reproductions, approximately 300 pioneers, artists, activists, authors, educators, government officials, temple members, and cultural contributors came together to present and sign what became known as the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace. The location alone was remarkable. The United Nations is most often associated with diplomacy between nations, humanitarian initiatives, international cooperation, and global dialogue. Few people would instinctively connect it with hip-hop. Yet perhaps that was the point. The gathering suggested that many of those involved no longer viewed hip-hop as a local movement or even simply an American one. They viewed it as an international culture. That distinction shaped the language of the Declaration from its opening paragraphs. Rather than presenting itself as a manifesto or a set of laws, the document describes itself as guidance. It explains that when questions arise about the meaning or purpose of hip-hop, members of the culture should be able to turn to the Declaration for advice and protection. That is a very different ambition from telling artists what they may or may not create. The Declaration does not attempt to police creativity. It attempts to preserve identity. One approach tries to control the future, the other tries to ensure the past is not forgotten. For a culture growing at extraordinary speed, that distinction mattered. Because every year that hip-hop expanded, new listeners entered the culture without necessarily encountering the people or ideas that had helped build it. The Declaration was, in many ways, an assurance of the memory of the culture in history, not just the music. Writing down what had largely been passed along. Cultures have always found ways to preserve themselves. Some rely on oral traditions, while others build libraries, museums, archives, schools, or historical societies. Others create constitutions or write declarations. Hip-hop had long relied on people with the stories shared between generations. The knowledge was exchanged in ciphers while lessons were learned at block parties, community centers, and neighborhood gatherings. Its history lived in conversations and in memories as much as documents. The hip-hop Declaration of Peace represents a different stage in that evolution, because it transformed ideas that had often been spoken into something written. Something that could be revisited, studied, and preserved. The document states that its purpose is to guide hip-hop toward freedom from violence while establishing advice and protection for the existence and continued development of the international hip-hop community. It also speaks about creating a foundation of health, love, awareness, wealth, peace, and prosperity not only for those present, but for future generations. That future-focused language deserves attention, as most entertainment is created for the present. Albums are released, tours begin, awards are handed out, charts change. Its authors were asking a different question. When future generations look back at hip-hop, what will they inherit besides recordings? That question feels even more relevant today than it did in 2001. The technology, distribution, and business has changed, while the culture continues to evolve. And the challenge of preserving its history remains remarkably familiar. More than entertainment. One sentence in the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace captures its central philosophy more clearly than perhaps any other. The essence of hip-hop is beyond entertainment. Read slowly, those 7 words reveal why the declaration exists, as they are not a criticism of entertainment. Hip-hop has entertained audiences for generations. DJs have moved dance floors. MCs have told stories that made people laugh, reflect, celebrate, and sometimes confront uncomfortable truths. Entire careers have been built on entertaining millions. The declaration never argues that entertainment is somehow beneath hip-hop. It challenges that entertainment alone cannot explain it. There is an important difference. By 2001, hip-hop had become an extraordinary commercial success. Record labels competed to sign artists. Clothing brands borrowed its style. Corporations recognized its marketing power. Radio stations dedicated entire formats to rap music. Around the world, young people adopted the language, fashion, and attitude associated with the culture. Success had changed the conversation. When hip-hop entered mainstream media, it was often discussed in economic terms. How many records did it sell? Who topped the charts? Which artist had the biggest tour? Which label controlled the market? Those are legitimate questions asked by industry executives. The declaration asks a different set of questions. What happens when commercial success becomes the primary way a culture is measured? What happens when market value begins replacing cultural value? What parts of hip-hop become easier to sell? What parts become easier to forget? Streaming services can calculate listeners down to the minute. Algorithms can recommend songs with astonishing accuracy. Sales figures, chart positions, and audience demographics can be measured almost instantly. And yet none of those systems can measure why a culture matters, calculate mentorship, or quantify community. They also cannot chart the influence of a neighborhood DJ who inspired dozens of young artists without ever releasing a platinum album, or assign a market value to the knowledge passed between generations. The declaration recognizes that difference, specifically in the 7th principle. The 7th principle acknowledges that the elements of hip-hop may generate money, honor, respect, food, shelter, information, and other resources. At the same time, it insists that hip-hop itself cannot be bought or sold because it represents the priceless principle of our self-empowerment. It concludes with a simple statement that continues to resonate more than 2 decades later. Hip-hop is not a product. Whether readers agree with that philosophy is ultimately their own decision. Its historical importance lies elsewhere. It demonstrates that, even as hip-hop became one of the world's most successful entertainment industries, there were voices within the culture arguing that its deepest value could never be measured by commercial success alone. That perspective offers an important counterbalance to the way hip-hop is often discussed today. The history of hip-hop is not only the history of platinum records. It is also the history of ideas. Sometimes those ideas survive long after the headlines have faded. The Hip Hop Declaration of Peace is one of those documents. A legacy still being written. Historical documents often become frozen in time. They are written, signed, and duly archived. The Hip Hop Declaration of Peace followed a different path. Although it has never achieved the public recognition of many defining moments in hip-hop history, the ideas it expressed did not disappear after May 16, 2001. They continued to surface in conversations about education, community, violence prevention, historical preservation, and the role of artists beyond entertainment. One example of this emerged more than 2 decades later. In 2024, Hip Hop for Peace joined with the UNESCO Center for Peace and the United States Federation of UNESCO Clubs, Centers, and Associations to organize Rap for Peace, a conference focused on gun violence awareness, trauma, mental wellness, and vulnerable communities. The event was not built around promoting a new album, nor was it a music festival. It was a gathering that treated hip-hop as a vehicle for dialogue, education, and community engagement. Among those participating were artists, public health professionals, educators, researchers, and community leaders. The discussions examined subjects that extended well beyond entertainment, including trauma, healing, violence prevention, and the responsibilities carried by influential cultural movements. In announcing the conference, executive producer Tina Marie Tyler described hip-hop as being born from historic and systemic trauma while also serving as a mechanism for healing and a catalyst for change. She argued that peace is foundational to hip-hop culture and should remain central to conversations surrounding National Gun Violence Awareness Day. Public Enemy founder Chuck D echoed that perspective, stating, "This nation's normalized behavior of gun violence is not normal. Hip-hop can and should lead the way to bring peace into our neighborhoods." Whether one agrees completely with those perspectives is not the central issue. What matters historically is the continuity, as more than 2 decades separate the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace and the Rap for Peace Conference. The people are different. The social challenges have evolved. The technology surrounding music has been transformed. Yet the underlying conversation remains strikingly familiar. Can hip-hop contribute something larger than entertainment? The declaration answered that question in one way. Rap for Peace continued asking it. That continuity suggests the declaration was never intended to be the conclusion of a conversation. It was intended to be one of its foundations. Remembering more than the records. Every culture chooses what it remembers. Sometimes those memories take the form of songs, become photographs, murals, documentaries, or museum exhibits, and other times they survive because someone took the time to write them down. The Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace belongs to that last category. Whether every reader embraces every principle it contains is ultimately beside the point. Historical documents are valuable because they preserve the aspirations of the people who created them. They allow future generations to examine not only what happened, but what those living through that history hoped might happen next. That is exactly what the Declaration offers. It captures a moment when hundreds of pioneers, artists, educators, activists, authors, government officials, and cultural contributors attempted to describe hip-hop in their own words before others defined it for them. They described it not simply as music, but as an international culture built upon education, creativity, responsibility, community, and peace. In an era where conversations about hip-hop are often dominated by streaming numbers, viral moments, celebrity headlines, and commercial success, documents like the Hip-Hop Declaration of Peace remind us that another history exists alongside those stories. It is a history concerned less with sales than stewardship, less with celebrity than community, and less with products than people. That history deserves to be remembered alongside every classic album, every legendary performance, and every groundbreaking artist. Because understanding hip-hop means understanding more than what it created. It means understanding what many within the culture believed it could become, and what it represented as a culture. For more than 2 decades, the hip-hop Declaration of Peace has quietly preserved one possible answer. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not that the declaration exists. It is that so few people know its story. This audio edition was adapted from the original written article published by Afterhours Archive 613. References and source materials are available in the original written article published by Afterhours Archive 613 on Substack.